Hi, I'm
Hi,
Nick,
I'm Jill.
and we're
We're
HipStrings
HipStrings.
again. Uh, so
It looks like it's working
it
now.
looks like it's working to all the comments. Thank you. Um, so uh, welcome to the last week, the last episode of the Great Mashup Spin Along. We are going to.
Walk you through picking a pattern.
There we go. So you had selected a pattern that
Yeah.
you liked.
Well, I'm going to start from the very beginning.
Okay.
Okay? So I had my first skein, washed it, hadn't, knew it was going to turn out to be a worsted, kind of light worsted. So
And show the ball again.
that's my first cake. So it puffed up enough, the twist kind of equaled out, all those squigglies worked themselves out. And so based on what my finished yarn was, I knew that I was going to be looking for about a 5 stitch per inch. So that's more based on my background knowledge of what wraps per inch yarn works up at a certain gauge. So different yarn weights like fingering, sport, DK, worsted, Aran, those all have ranges. And so and the gauge for a yarn weight varies. Okay, you can get away with kind of, usually it's about, you have a standard deviation about 0.5.
Well, that also
stitches
depends.
per inch.
That also depends very much on what size needles you're using,
Right.
and how what's your tension, all that stuff. But that's all going to change how drapey and how open
Right.
the end pattern is. So,
in my experience, for me, a light worsted yarn knits up very nicely at 5 stitches to the inch.
Okay. So there's sort of two ways to look for a pattern from that standpoint, then, right?
Right.
You want to look for a pattern that has the type of yarn you're looking for,
Yeah.
right, or the type of yarn that you've created.
Mm-hmm.
And last time we talked a little bit about how you use the control card in order to measure the wraps per inch, and then use that to know that you are in fingering, sport, DK, whatever. And then the other part of that, though, is that different patterns are going to have different stitch counts, right?
Yes.
So, okay, let's say you found a pattern that you like that kind of sort of matches your weight of yarn
weight, yeah,
and kind of sort of matches the stitches per inch that you're used to, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So one thing I would do is check what yarn the pattern calls for, and look at the grist of that yarn, what type of yarn it calls for.
So when you look at a pattern, though, you're never going to find something that says here's the grist, right?
Yes, but it will usually tell you what yarn, and that will give you yardage per so many grams or how many ounces.
So you got to do a little bit of homework there, right? So if it recommends, you've got that beautiful picture, this is what it looks like, and it recommends a certain yarn, okay, now you need to go and look at that yarn and say how many yards per pound that you end up getting from that, and try and match that up with what you have,
right?
With what you've created.
So really the first step is, if you don't have a history of knowing, oh, I like a light worsted yarn worked up at 5 stitches per inch, or I like a DK yarn worked up at 5.5, then the first step is to swatch. So here's my tiny swatch. So I usually don't make my swatches too tall, just because I get impatient, and once I know I've got my an idea of my stitch gauge and my row gauge, I'm good. So, and what I do to identify my swatches is I'll do one row where I put holes by doing a knit 2 together and then yarn over, and I'll do as many of those as the US size of the needle. So this was knit with a US 4 needle. And this was mostly, the swatch is just not necessarily what needle I'm going to use for the pattern, because my circular knitting is different than my knitting back and forth. But I really like this fabric. It has some give. It's not super strong. You can't see through it.
We need to rewind a little bit, though.
Yes.
Okay, because I feel like we're jumping around a little bit too much here. So let's start off with, that is not just what came off the needles, right? So, did you wash and block that?
No, not.
Well, now I'm going to tell you you've done something wrong, right?
Yes. Well,
okay,
I'm going to say...
Well,
I have experience, and my experience is saying I don't need to wash this.
Okay. Well, so let's start back again. This is the podcast for starting over, and I think it's actually fantastic as a metaphor, because whenever you're going to be doing a project, right, you are going to have to knit a little bit, rip back, or knit several swatches, because this is new yarn. This is something different, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you start off. You got the cake.
Yes.
You washed it. You've caked it.
Yes.
You want to knit a swatch. Why do you want to knit a swatch?
Because I want to know if this yarn knits up nicely at the gauge I think it's going to knit up at.
Okay. And where you use the one theoretical pattern in order to find a target gauge. Right? So you find a pattern that you like, a target gauge.
Okay. I don't play that way. I have target gauges I have for each yarn weight for myself.
Okay, so what we probably should do is make a chart to give people that as a good starting point.
Yes.
Because we're trying to give people, exactly, like Summerhill Spinner's saying here, for those of us mortals that don't have a lot of experience, what can we do from get-go zero, right?
Okay. So if we're talking about garments, because garments are where you really do need to pay attention to gauge, okay? If you have made yarn and you just want to turn it into something that does not have to be well fitted, something like a shawl or a cowl or a scarf, then doing your gauge swatch is just more of a check to make sure that you won't run out of yarn. Okay, because if your gauge is off, you might run out of yarn.
So that's for something that's not fitted. Right?
For something that's not fitted.
For something that is fitted,
then your gauge is going to tell you whether or not the final garment
fit.
is going to fit.
Right.
Okay.
So, I think I'm still a little bit stuck in terms of, okay, I have my yarn, it's washed, I know what weight it is, I even know the grist. How do I even know what needle to pick?
Okay.
To make my swatch?
If you don't have a lot of experience.
I don't.
Then it's a good idea to find a standard pattern.
Okay.
That calls for that yarn weight.
Now, what do you mean by a standard pattern? A pattern you like.
A pattern you like in a stitch pattern, like you're probably going to want to swatch and stockinette. Okay.
So you want what you're saying is that from an initial trial, you probably want to do stockinette, something that doesn't have a lot of cabling, something that doesn't have a lot of pattern. And I think that fits very well with the fact that we're doing this mashup. The point of the mashup is to get a lot of interesting color and a lot of interesting texture from the color,
You're
from the spin.
You're going to be looking for a pattern that is fairly simple.
Right, because you want to be able to show off the coloring.
Right.
So, I think Angela has a very good question that we can refer back to the previous podcast, but just as a quick
as a
reminder.
Grist is yards per pound.
Yeah.
So if you take any measurement as far as the length of your yarn and can put it into a ratio of how many yards you have per pound, then you have grist. Grist is very useful for yarn substitution, to let you know whether or not your handspun that you're substituting into a pattern is at all similar to the yarn that the designer used.
And in terms of
the pattern,
how to specifically measure it, there's a couple of different ways. Again, if you want to be super duper accurate, you can go and measure the entire length of your skein, and then weigh that. That's a bit of a pain, but if you've got a tool like a skein winder that actually has a counter on it, that ends up being a lot easier. If you use like a nitty knotty that has a known length for each total wind, then you can count how many strands you have and then multiply that by the length of that wind. Or the recommendation that we had was get a kitchen scale or a spice scale uh, off of Amazon, and use a much smaller length, maybe like a foot or a couple of feet of
Yeah.
your yarn. Snip that off. What were you saying was a good length for?
10 yards will
10
get
yards
you a swatch.
will get you a swatch, so you can easily measure that out. That's sort of an intermediate, right? You can measure that out, cut that off, weigh it, and then you can get
So it's
the
a
grist.
different type of measurement than wraps per inch. Grist really tells you about the density of your yarn. And so sometimes you can have really dense yarn and it's going to drape in a way and it's going to knit up in a way that's different than a yarn that is lighter.
Yeah,
Because your knit stitch is not always going to have the same ratios, and that's why patterns often give you both a stitch gauge, how many stitches per inch, as well as a row gauge, how many rows per inch.
and so grist is going to impact not only your stitch count, much like wraps per inch will, but it will impact the stretchiness and the drape of the garment. So, if you've ever, I see Angela, you're noting that you've never knit a garment, but if you've ever knit even a shawl or something, if it doesn't lay like it does in the picture that you've seen, chances are it's because of a difference in grist.
Yeah. So it's like alpaca silk is a very different grist than 100% wool.
Yeah. So,
But what if you don't have a pattern? If you're just trying to look for what needle should I use to try to knit up what I think is a worsted weight yarn, then you can go and look up standard worsted weight yarns. And usually on the yarn label they have a recommended needle size.
trying to see if we've got any labels from other.
No, I toss my labels.
Anyways, yeah. So you'll usually find that they'll recommend a needle size. I always know that I need to go, and I don't remember which way it is. It's either two needles.
You go smaller.
I go
because
2
we're
needles
loose
smaller.
knitters.
I always have to go 2 needles smaller. I know it's 2. I didn't remember which direction it is, but I always have to go 2 needles smaller whenever I'm looking at a recommended pattern size in order to get the same gauge. So this is a very much an experimental thing for everybody, and that's why, going back to your swatch, it's
So
a good
most
idea
people
when you knit
would
a swatch.
a-
Let me finish.
Yeah.
It's a good idea when you knit a swatch that you make sure you mark it with what you knit it with. And so I'd never seen this before, but this is a beautiful idea. That you can make these yarn over holes, yarn over and knit 2 togethers in some row in order to note, okay, this was done with a size 4. So then if you end up knitting 3-4 swatches and you try and figure out which one is the one you like the best, you know which one it is rather than having to go back to
And
writing.
if you're an experienced knitter, you'll be like, Jill, knitting a worsted weight yarn on a US 4, doesn't that seem awfully tight? Not for me. I'm very loose.
Yeah. So, okay, you were going to say something else. I apologize.
I don't remember what I was going to say.
Oh, now I really apologize.
Um,
In the meantime, why don't we
yeah, well,
say...
let's answer some questions.
So, Summerhill Spinner says, can the grist of commercial yarn be misleading when compared to handspun?
So it depends on your particular flavor of hand spinning.
But that's also the point of grist, right?
Yes, it is the point of grist.
Right.
So a lot of hand spinners, especially if you spin short forward draw, and you don't let a lot of air into your yarn, and you might have a tendency to overply, then your grist is you're gonna have a lower grist. You're gonna have less yards per pound than typically a commercial yarn of the same weight.
Yeah.
And that is important because your yarn is gonna act like a yarn that has more drape, even if it is 100% wool.
Yeah, and that goes very much to the point that Kathleen was putting up in terms of a 10 wraps per inch. Worsted is different than a 10 wraps per inch woolen in terms of grist. Right. They have the same wraps per inch, but because of that different density, because of the different amount of air, they're going to have different grist.
And the 10 wraps per inch woolen, because it'll have a higher grist, it'll have more yards per pound, it can actually knit up at a more wide range of gauge. it's more versatile. And different wools, um, wools like Targhee, Rambouillet, Falkland, Polworth, they can often be knit up at several different gauges, whereas things that have a heavier grist or lower yards per pound often have a very specific gauge that they are happy being knitted up at.
Yep. And there's been a couple of other recommendations on how to mark your gauge, your swatch gauge, your swatch in terms of what size needle. Pearl bumps suggested by Kathleen, also a good idea. And then Elizabeth has tying knots to the tail to show the needle size. All fantastic ideas. I like all of those. I had gone the route of like sticking a tag to it with a pin and writing on that tag, and then it gets ripped off because the kids jump on the couch, and that's a mess. I like your guys' ideas better. Yeah. So then there's the question of what size do you?
Okay, so I always do. I take what how many stitches I expect in 4 inches, and add it to by 50%, so that I'm actually knitting what I think will be 6 inches wide. And so I was aiming for 5 stitches to the inch with the swatch, so I cast on 30 stitches.
And typically a 4-inch by 4-inch is what people recommend. As you said, you get impatient. That's okay, as we all do. There's an important thing that you'll notice with this swatch is that it's not just straight going into stockinette, right?
I do a garter edge so that it doesn't curl as much. Exactly. So it's easier to lay flat.
Lay flat, and then you can measure. 4-inch by 4-inch is good because, I mean, even now, and you can see this a little bit with yours as well, right? You will start off at a certain gauge, and then as you're getting your getting into the groove, your gauge will change a little bit, right? So you want to make sure that you have enough so that you've got an even, continuous gauge, right?
And somebody, there is a general guideline of doubling the yarn that you have and putting it through a needle gauge to see the recommended needle.
Interesting.
I've never tried that, mostly because standards don't usually work for me, because I usually have to go down at least 2 needle sizes, and how many sizes I need to go down depends on the relative size of the needles.
And really, any of these recommendations that you see in terms of starting points, there are starting points. Everybody's going to be knitting different. That's why there are so many different needle sizes and different needle types. If you start on a wooden needle and then your kids jump on the couch, like has happened to me, and then you have to switch to a metal needle, your gauge is going to change, right? So all of these things are, you try, you experiment,
knitting flat,
you learn,
knitting and the round is going to change.
So
that's why this is a guideline. Do not take this as gospel. I made this swatch actually after I cast on for my project.
You're just doing everything wrong.
No. Okay. I have experience.
Okay.
Experience lets you take some shortcuts. But I wanted to show you guys, the proper way is, this swatch is about, do you like the fabric that this yarn plus that needle that you're using makes? Okay? That's what this is about. It is not trying to hit a certain goal. I'm just lucky in that I did hit my goal. It is, do you like this fabric? Okay? Because this is going to be the fabric of your garment. And
fabric
no matter
in terms
what,
of drape and fluff and feel.
And if you have fabric that you are happy with, you can find a pattern to work with it. Okay? There are so many thousands of patterns available online these days, and there are also good resources that allow you to take, a swatch and turn it into a garment. And I'm going to share some of my favorites with you.
Before we get to that, I do want to address 2 other things to that. One is that's not actually the fabric you're going to get
No.
in your finest. For two
It
reasons.
just tells me that I like this yarn knitted up at this gauge.
For two reasons, though. One is the fact that your knitting is going to change when you switch to knitting in the round. Right?
Yeah, so I might not get to work with these size needles in my garment.
And number two is washing and blocking.
Yes.
So what is your opinion on washing and blocking that swatch?
You should.
Okay.
I didn't. Because I am wise.
Well, also because there was 2 days between, our last podcast and this one. But, okay,
Shortcuts,
so
people.
washing and blocking. We talked about washing in the last podcast, so if you want to get some more details on that, you can take a look at that podcast. I apologize, we have not yet uploaded the video of Jill snapping or whacking or washing or any of that stuff. It's been very cold outside, and we wanted to do it outside. For some reason,
it's been in the 40s here.
It snowed the past 2 days, and it is almost May.
And then it's going to rain for like the next 4 days.
All right.
So.
Okay. Last thing that I want to say about swatches, is that because we keep talking about, okay, there's a difference about knitting in the round if we're knitting a garment.
Well, we're going to talk about, this is not the last time you will check your gauge.
Okay.
This is the first time you will check your gauge.
Should I hold off on sleeves?
Yes.
Okay. So then let's address some questions first. So Kathleen's agreeing with the 6 by 6 inches for getting a swatch. Don't do 1 by 1. Bottom line.
No.
Don't do 8 by 8. Probably too big.
Yeah.
Let's see. Charan says, and is extending the comment from Kathleen, gauge will change if you're stressed and relaxed too, and if you're enjoying knitting the yarn.
It'll tell,
yeah. So your gauge will change.
Yeah.
And I've never had it change so much that I want to change needles mid-project.
Spoiler alert. I will not knit my garment with the same needles I knit this swatch with because my garment is being knit in the round, and my gauge differs when knitting back and forth than knitting in the round.
So Angela has a very good question in terms of, so why, if I just washed my yarn, do I need to wash and block the swatch? What changes?
Sometimes it'll change because of how you knit. You can actually change the shape of your stitches when you block. And so you can actually use blocking to try to see if you can get the fabric to match a certain gauge. You can stretch things. So when wool is wet, it's kind of very flexible. You can make it, it's more easy to stretch it out this way and have it stay this way. Or if you want it to get taller, you can stretch, this way and have it stay that way.
So what's interesting is that the washing and whacking that we did before is about changing
evening out the
yarn.
Twist and changing the yarn.
The washing and blocking that we're doing after you do the swatch is about changing the fabric.
Stitches. Yeah,
it's evening out the stitches. It's evening out all of the individual aspects of it. So there is some other details in terms of how do you block it. Do you stretch it and lay it? Do you add some weight to it? When I took a class with Laura Nelkin about her patterns and how to get the proper stitch gauge, because it's very important to get the proper stitch
for certain patterns
and row gauge for her patterns. She talked a lot about when you're knitting and then you block your swatch, you want to make sure that you add a little bit of weight to the parts, or you add a little bit of weight to it, because as you're wearing it, that's going to pull down and change your gauge over the time period that you're wearing it, right? So in order to get the proper fit over an extended period of time, you want to make sure that you are blocking appropriately to the final product. So there's a whole art to how to properly block. In terms of why didn't you knit the swatch in the round?
I have good reasons for this.
Go ahead.
So, normally, if I'm going to knit a sweater in the round, I start knitting part of the sweater as part of my swatch. I often start with sleeves. Um, and especially if it's a bottom up sweater, I will start by swatching, by knitting my sleeve. Because usually I'm fairly confident that I will get things right. And then, yay, I've got the start of a sleeve. If I've screwed up, it's not that big of a loss to tear out a sleeve. However, the pattern that I'm aiming for is a bottom up body, and then you pick up stitches around the armholes and knit your sleeves down.
Weird.
So starting a sleeve doesn't work with the pattern.
So I'm going to say that you are doing the exception to the rules in all of these cases. Do what we tell you to do, not what we do, right?
Okay, I knit dangerously, but I am always checking my gauge while I'm knitting.
And you're willing to rip back.
I'm willing to rip back and make changes to my garment as I'm knitting it to make sure that my gauge is what I'm aiming for.
So, in all honesty, if you want to, if you're not 100% certain, if you're not super experienced with knitting with your own handspun, if you've got some questions about what you're knitting, absolutely. What you should do is knit your swatch in the round with the needles you expect to use. Don't say I'm going to use metal needles for the swatch and then wooden needles that you got 2 weeks later because you like them to. No, you want to re-swatch with those then to really understand how it's going to change. That being said, obviously, as you learn more, you can make changes and you can skip some of these steps. But if you're really playing it safe, swatch in the round, wash that how you'd wash it normally, block it how you'd not block it normally, even add a little bit of weight. And what I mean by a little bit of weight, I mean like one binder clip on the bottom, and hang it over the edge of a table or something.
Yeah.
Not like take your fishing weights and, and give it some serious weight. Even to that degree, though, I wouldn't worry too much about it, because
even the time when you did that, it didn't work out.
Well, I think, the pattern I was going for was
checking your gauge throughout the process of knitting is much better path than just worrying so much about your swatch and then never paying attention to your gauge again.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like we already talked about this is
spinning, giving you
right?
a starting point. It is telling you whether or not you have a good idea of whether or not the yarn and the needles together make a fabric that you like.
Yeah.
Okay? It is not really that informative of whether or not you are going to end up knitting a garment that is going to fit you the way you want it to fit you.
So, I mean, and we talked about this a lot with the spinning, right? You're checking your gauge, essentially, with your spinning. So it makes sense to us now, right, after we've gone through this entire process. Of course you should check your gauge as you're knitting.
Right.
It's just most knitters don't think about this because they think, okay, needles equals gauge equals product. Yeah. But as we know, even from the spinning process, that sort of stuff can change.
Right.
So Charan brings a great point of if you're going to wash your garment at some point, it's good to know how your swatch will behave after washing.
Does it stretch a lot, vertically versus
how much can you change it, right? Like as you're blocking it, you have more mobility and flexibility of the stitches.
Your swatch is an idea of learning about the fabric that you are going to produce.
Yeah. And Kathleen brings up one of my arch nemeses, alpaca. It grows the longer you wear it. Abso-frickin-lutely. And I think we talked about this when we were talking about picking fiber. Be very careful with alpaca, especially on a sweater.
Especially 100%.
I started with...
Blends behave a lot better.
Yeah.
Blends.
I knit myself an alpaca sweater because my first knitting book I learned to knit from called Knitting with Balls. It
called for alpaca yarn?
It's specifically knitwear for men. And it called for alpaca yarn for a particular sweater. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do this just like this. It'll be great. I think I even matched the color of everything. It was awesome. I knit it. It fit perfectly the first time. And like by the fourth time I wore it, it was down at my knees. Literally. It's amazing how much that stuff will stretch.
Yeah. And I remember telling you, hey, Nick, check your gauge while you're knitting. You're like, oh no, my swatch was fine.
Yeah.
Famous last words.
Angela asked the question, can I swatch after I pick my pattern?
Can you block after you pick your pattern?
And then she corrected herself a swatch. See, I'm reading ahead. Yes. Can I swatch after I pick my pattern? Actually, yes. And I would recommend that you do in case you have something that has some pattern to the stitches. So we say we want to emphasize the beauty of the actual spin itself, but if you have something that has like a seed stitch or some level of
texture
or anything like that, that's what you want to swatch to. You don't want to swatch to stockinette and then plan on garter knit, right?
You should be able to use your wraps per inch to inform kind of what patterns may work for you. And then once you find a pattern, then doing your swatch is like auditioning that yarn for that pattern. And the more complicated the pattern, the more complicated the stitch pattern, the more leeway there is in yarn choice.
So Joanne asks a very complicated question of when a pattern says net 15 inches, is that the blocked length?
It depends on the designer.
Yeah, so this is one of those crazy things of when you are looking at a pattern and it tells you to knit a certain length, you need to sort of get into the mind of the designer and figure out what do they mean by that length, because, and also what does that mean for your particular size, right? Okay, so every pattern has a certain range of sizes for a range of people. As a guy, none of those are ever right? So I have to get into this mindset of looking at patterns and trying to figure out, do they have a lot of different measurements that I can adjust and change the number of stitches for those areas, and then try and figure out, are they talking about pre-blocked length or post-blocked length? And really, the only thing that matters is when I'm about to wear it, is it going to fit my dimensions, right? Yeah. So you have to do a little bit of deconstruction.
Yeah. So very good knitwear designers for garments will provide you both schematics for what you knit, so that your knit lengths, and then what you block to. And they will tell you specifically, you are knitting to this length and it will block to this length.
Yeah. So this is actually where it...
this is why you pay for garment patterns.
Yeah. And if you have any experience with sewing, right, this is, and sewing your own clothing, this is where that realm crosses over with this one, right? Because that gives you a good idea of how things fit you and how you adjust those patterns. You're going to do the exact same thing for knitting patterns, except now you have to make the fabric.
Right.
And Angela has a great point here of reading through the pattern fully. Some designers will say knit to A and block to B. Now, all of this being said, this goes against my complete nature. As an engineer,
you just want to make something to schematics.
I want to open the Lego instruction manual and it says, get block A. Okay, I've got block A. Now put block B on top of block A right here. Okay. I hate it when a pattern says, do this, this, and this. By the way, before you do step number 2, you should have done this other giant part of the section.
At the same time?
At the same time. It drives me nuts. So I need to go against my nature and read the entire pattern. So absolutely, read ahead. It's not like a murder mystery, right?
Yeah.
You want to know what the end of the pattern is, study it, realize it even before you start knitting.
So here's where I'm going to step in and share some resources that I use when knitting hand knit sweaters. Because these are ones that really are useful when you're not 100% sure of gauge, and they talk about stuff usually in terms of measuring lengths of the garment, not knitting to a certain number of rows, which is very important if your row gauge isn't exactly what the gauge is supposed to be. And just some really good, I think, fairly simple patterns that really do a good job of showing off handspun yarn and work for a variety of sizes, and both male and female bodies.
Yeah, and while you're grabbing that, I'll say, you don't necessarily, especially for your first project, want to make something that is tight and fitted, right?
Yeah,
you want to make
for
something
about
that,
1 to 3 inches of positive ease.
and define positive ease.
So positive ease is that the garment itself measures so many inches more than your actual body measurements.
Yeah.
So our chest measurements are both 42 inches. And so 1 to 3 inches of positive ease would be a sweater where the finished chest measurement of the garment would be somewhere between 43 and 45 inches.
So another way of thinking about it is positive ease is it's loose, you have a little bit of extra room. Negative ease, it's tight and your body is pushing up against it.
Right.
Okay. So let's talk about some of these resources.
This is my favorite. This is Ann Budd's book of top-down sweaters. And so the great thing about this book, so it is basic designs in multiple gauges and sizes. So it goes everywhere from I think toddler to adult sizes. Let's see exactly how.
So while Jill's looking that up, the fantastic thing about this is not only does it have some level of patterns in it, but it's really generically designed so that you can fit in just about anything you want into it. And it works like a recipe book in terms of, okay, I want to have a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I want to have this type of sleeve. I want to have this type of body, etc.
Yeah. And this goes from a 26-inch to 54-inch chest circumferences in 2-inch increments. And then this also gives you the numbers for a gauge from 3 stitches to the inch to 7 stitches to the inch in 1 stitch per inch increments. Okay. So it can be a little bit confusing to follow, because your pattern looks something like this. It's lots of tables, but if you really are getting confused by everything, you could, write your own version of it.
Yeah, you take out the sections that you want, write it in another document. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure for a knitting pattern.
Yeah, but it has a seamless yoke, a raglan, a set-in sleeve, a saddle shoulder, and a saddle shoulder, and then gives you options for different necks, for different cuffs, and then it has a couple example patterns that are done in a specific yarn gauge.
So while you look for the next pattern, I do want to address Kinspa. She has a great comment of check on Ravelry, look at the comments, see if people have had problems with that pattern. That's a great way to see if before you go and spend money on a pattern or a book, Ravelry is a great resource. People will be honest about their feelings on different things.
Yeah.
And apparently, Kinspa wants me to call her by Angela.
Yeah. This is another one. It's also Ann Budd. Same kind of thing, but not just top-down sweaters, but also hats and scarves and gloves and stuff. Also really useful if you are working with handspun.
Okay.
And then there's good old Elizabeth Zimmerman. Okay. One of Nick's Mashup sweaters that he wore in one of the live streams was I think the hybrid saddle shoulder from Elizabeth Zimmerman. And a great thing about Elizabeth Zimmerman is she often gives percentage systems for her sweater constructions. So if you know your gauge and you know your body measurements, or like what measurement of sweater you're going for, you can do the math and figure out the stitch counts for each thing. So it requires a little bit more math, but she does a good job of outlining the structures of different garments and that you can plug into, which can be difficult using other knitwear designer patterns. And then I'll also recommend any of the patterns from Tin Can Knits. Tin Can Knits has a whole bunch of patterns. A lot of them are free, that they aren't multiple gauge patterns, but they have a wide range of sizes from infant to large adult, so very size inclusive. Also generally gender neutral patterns that are extremely well written and give you all those measurements of each step along the way and how it will block and all that stuff. Great schematics, and a really great resource for knitwear patterns.
What I was also thinking, the sweater, or the sweater pattern that we used for our Star Wars sweaters.
That was a Tin Can Knits.
Okay, I was going to say that in and of itself is fantastically
that was a really,
written. And that one's really nice.
Strange Brew, which is a yoke sweater pattern, and it's kind of designed for doing color work.
Yeah.
But it is given in multiple gauges, in a super size inclusive range from child to adult, as well as gender neutral, and how to adapt to different yarn gauges.
And if you want to do something crazy, like combine your mashup spin with a more single color to provide a pattern, you can really drop in any sort of pattern that you want to put in that yoke. I have to say, it is the first sweater that I knit for myself that I was really happy with the fit.
Yeah. And actually, I've done one, and I plan on doing more. If you don't want to do an entire sweater spin of handspun, a really good way to use like a 4-ounce braid of handspun in a sweater is to do a color work yoke. And do your color work with the handspun, and then pick a solid mill spun for the rest of your sweater.
So I do want to go back to a couple of comments. Angela had a great summary in terms of where was that? So get your reps per inch, get your grist, pick a pattern, swatch.
Yes.
So, and when you swatch, you can swatch flat to get an idea of the fabric, but really what you want to do in the end is you want to swatch in the method that you're going to be knitting. So if you're going to be knitting, panels, great, okay, fine, knit back and forth. But if you're going to be knitting in the round, swatch in the round.
And an easy way to swatch in the round is knit a sleeve.
Exactly. So then Angela has the question about positive and negative ease confuse her. She can never figure out sizes. One reason she has never knit a garment. Yeah.
Amy Herzog has a lot of great resources on fitting your sweater to your body and adapting patterns to your body.
What was that pamphlet that was really popular a couple of years back? That was another one of these like program your own sweater.
Yeah, that's Amy Herzog.
That's Amy Herzog.
It's her custom fit, which you could do a custom fit pattern from Amy Herzog for handspun. With that system, you need to have a whole bunch of body measurements, and then you knit a fairly large swatch, and then you plug in information from the swatch and your body measurements, and it will give you a pattern.
Yeah. Joanne had a comment that at SSK's try-it-on room, she noticed a lot of the sweaters were knit too loose gauge, and they all looked droopy. Yeah.
It's kind of a pet peeve of mine. So knitwear designers keep on designing sweaters that are knit at far too loose of a gauge for the yarn they're using. And therefore you have really drapey sweaters that look kind of sleazy. Not in the
prostitute-y way,
but like they have no structure to them, and they don't necessarily look good after a couple of wearings.
So
and so this goes into my whole certain yarns should be knit at certain gauges, and you should not be trying to take a fingering weight yarn and knitting it at, a worsted weight gauge of like 5 stitch to the inch.
No, because you're gonna get really big open holes and everything.
Yeah. And it has no structure.
So this is a big problem I find if you're going to be knitting for a man, whether it be yourself or someone else. Every time, I can't even think of a single knit photo of a pattern for a guy that the fit looks right. They will knit it, and then they'll put it on a model that's about like 2 sizes too small for the pattern, and it's just bleh. So it really is hard for me to find a pattern that I can look at and I'm like, yeah, I can see myself in that.
Yeah.
So
some other night, I will happily rant about what gauge certain yarns should be knit at. And I often take some of those patterns that are the yarn that's recommended, I think is way too thin for what the gauge they're trying to knit it at, and substitute in a heavier weight yarn for the pattern at that same recommended gauge, and it gives you a sweater that works a lot better. I've done that before. Sweaters that I've called for fingering weight, and I'll sub in a sport weight instead.
Yeah. So I was going to say maybe we're getting a little bit too off topic, but really this is the crux of the topic, right? You've got a pattern. You want to find the right mix of pattern to yarn to you, right? Or the target audience of the knit. It is hard. I mean, heck, they made TV shows about how people like to wear droopy clothes, right? Like I remember What Not to Wear on TLC, right? That was in younger days, that was an epiphany for me, right? The fact that you want to wear things that skin tight, but something that fits well
and has structure.
It's even harder when you're making it for yourself. Be gentle. You've already made some yarn. That's impressive. Making something that fits decently is impressive as well. So you don't have to go for the perfect fit, but know that the more times you do it, the more experience you have, the more times you try, the better off you're going to be. You're going to make
mistakes, and by making mistakes, if you take the chance to examine your mistakes and be like, okay, what did I do? And admit to yourself you did something wrong, then you can learn by fixing that mistake how to make things better. You should always learn from your mistakes.
And really, it's the only way to learn about how to do knitting better is to make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
I guarantee you the first thing you ever knit does not look as good as what you're knitting now, right? Unless this is the first time you're knitting, which I'm very impressed.
So we've characterized the yarn. We've knit a swatch. We've picked a pattern.
Okay.
And now we're knitting.
Okay. There's more?
There's more. So I was talking about how you don't just check your gauge on your swatch.
Yeah.
You are going to be checking your gauge the entire time you're knitting. Okay? So, right now I'm knitting ribbing. This really doesn't matter what the gauge is. I went down my usual 2 needle sizes for ribbing. Ribbing is stretchy. If you like the way the ribbing looks, it's good.
But okay, so you glossed over something which was an epiphany for me. When you're doing ribbing, you should be knitting at a smaller needle size than the rest of your pattern.
Yes.
Because if you knit
want that stretch.
Right. You want it to actually come in.
You want it to have negative ease.
And by going down 2 needle sizes, you're going to have it come in. But it's going to be able to stretch a lot more because it's ribbing.
Right.
Okay, go on.
Okay. But I've got 2 inches of this to do, and I was not able to. I really wanted to, but I wasn't able to finish 2 inches of ribbing for you guys for me to get to my stockinette section. So, when you get to your main stitch pattern, whether or not it's just stockinette, then you are going to, knit about 1 inch maybe, and then you're going to measure your gauge again. And the best way I find to do this is to take like one of our tools that has a notch in it. So this has a 2-inch notch in the side. And I can do this on my swatch. And I can take that notch and just pick some stitches and see how many of those stitches fit in that notch. And so 10 stitches fit in that 2-inch notch on my swatch. And I know that, so this, you do want to measure and keep track of your measurements on both your unblocked and your blocked swatch. Okay? Because your block swatch tells you what the measurement of your garment is going to be after it's washed. Your unblocked swatch tells you what the measurements are going to be on your garment before it's washed.
Yeah. And you want to look at both your row gauge and your stitch gauge, right?
Yes.
The horizontal and the vertical.
Yes. Because ratios are important. And then, so I'm just going to, every couple of inches while I'm knitting, check how many stitches I'm getting per, like, 2 inches. Counting over more than an inch is better than counting over just an inch, so I usually do 2 inches. And then divide by 2, and that will give you how many stitches per inch.
So I do want to point out to, or bring out the one of our friends, Ackerworks. They have a fantastic swatch tool. As what is it just called, a swatch tool? Or
it's a gauge
tool?
Yeah. It's really great. It has teeth that hold on to things.
So if you're putting something down, if you've got a large enough piece for this, it's our swatches are too small for.
It does a 4x4.
But if you've got a 4x4, you can lay this on, and that way you make sure you don't stretch things out. Angela asked the question, does she need 2 swatches?
No, you take one swatch, you measure it, both the row gauge and the stitch gauge and row gauge. Write that down. And then wash it, and then take those same measurements and write them down. Okay? So you don't need to have 2 swatches, one you wash and one you don't.
Yeah. And Kathleen does make the comment of horizontal is more important for the swatching because you can always add more rows if need be.
Yes.
Yes, depending on the pattern. So again...
Yeah, so some patterns, like how deep your armhole, depends on that row height. Yeah. And so you might have, if your row height or row gauge is significantly different than what's called for in the pattern, then you may have to do different math to figure out how to space increase or decreases in your pattern.
Yeah. So if absolutely the stitch gauge is generally more important, but there's some areas where the row gauge is just as important, if not more so. So it is a good idea to at least keep track of it, keep it in mind, and if the pattern calls for it specifically, worry about it. The Lauren Elkin patterns, because they are knit not top down or bottom up, they're knit
side
left to
side.
right. The row gauge is much more important in that case. So, okay.
But I've actually had sweaters I've knit where it was a mill spun yarn, but it knit up at a very different gauge than it should have. And so my gauge differed, and I was mixing yarns. I was doing a color work yoke in a hand spun, and then using a yarn that ended up being kind of a different weight, even though it knitted up a different weight, even though they were the same wraps per inch. And I ended up having to change my stitch count in the garment and my needle size to get the right, garment measurement. And I was able to recognize I was having that problem because I was checking my gauge every couple of inches. And I could be like, oh, this is suddenly not knitting up at the same gauge as the previous part of my sweater. And so I could make changes. I could do decreases or do increases so that the size of my garment is still right.
I'll also point out, Kathleen makes a comment of that's where the dreaded maths come into play, but I do want to say it shouldn't be dreaded. You can do this. This is, the complicated thing is you're taking a string and making it
into
into
a garment.
a three-dimensional fabric, right? Even if you're following somebody's directions to do it, the physical dexterity that is necessary in order to achieve that is beyond what most of the people in the world are capable of today, right? You have an amazing skill. The math is literally just counting and multiplying, which is just counting in a short form, right? Don't be afraid of the math. You may not be used to it, but it is very straightforward, and I know each and every one of you can do it. And if you have any questions, you know, Jill or I or anybody else on this list, I'm sure, are more than happy to talk to you and answer some questions about it.
But do pay attention to your gauge while you're knitting. Somebody who's sitting on the couch, who's not me,
I'm not sitting anymore.
likes to start knitting sweaters and then be like, so I'm not sure if this is right. And I'm like, what's your gauge? Measure your gauge. How many stitches per inch are you knitting at? And what are you supposed to be getting? And he'd be like, what's kind of close? I'm only off by like 1 stitch per inch. I'm like, well, multiply that by how many inches round you're doing. So if you're knitting at 5 stitches to the inch, and you're actually knitting at, you're supposed to be knitting at 5, and you're actually knitting at 4, then you are making your garment 20% bigger than it should be.
Yeah. So, to give you an idea of how many inches that ends up being,
about 8 inches of positive ease on a sweater for somebody our size.
So one stitch per inch is quite a big number. It's important to keep checking it. I get excited about the act of knitting. I like knitting.
Yeah.
Nick's
a process knitter. I'm a product knitter. I'm much more concerned about what the final thing's going to look like.
But and I was going to comment on this too before with when it comes to, okay, you really want to get a good fit. You really want to swatch the part that you want. It is one of the most painful things to me to knit up the swatch, block it, and then wait the 12 hours for the damn thing to dry and not do anything else, right? So make sure you've got an easy, dumb project that doesn't require the blocking on the side so that you can jump to that in your excitement. That's what I end up having to do. I've got a giant...
Or you can start on your ribbing while you're waiting for your swatch to dry.
Right, whatever. But, like, it is worth it to do that. You will save a lot of emotional pain later on from the ripping back. And I say that with the added comment of, don't be afraid to rip back. A finished garment that doesn't fit will never fit.
Right.
A garment that you rip back and redo sections or the whole thing will eventually be good. And I'm sort of stealing the phrase.
You have already invested so much time in that yarn.
Yeah.
That it is not that much loss to rip back an hour or 2 of knitting, okay, or even days of knitting, in order to make sure that in the end you have something that you are going to love and that makes you feel good when you are wearing it and that you are going to wear for years.
And this is not only a philosophy that comes from, you know, knitters like us, right? It's the phrasing that I stole is actually very similar to the head of Nintendo has said to fans that were disappointed that a game was delayed by saying a game that's released early is permanently bad. A game that's delayed will eventually be good, right? So, and I'm not sure I got the exact phrasing right, but yes, you may be a week later on finishing your product, but you're going to have a product that you actually love rather than one that you have spent the months on and then just put in the closet because you're not completely happy with it.
And I also say this, for people who are worried that they aren't good enough to knit themselves a sweater, that their knitting isn't good enough, they can't keep on gauge, Okay. I've knit a lot of sweaters for myself. It is probably the most thing I have is I have knit sweaters. Um, I still have trouble knitting gloves and hats and mitts that fit. Okay? My gauge is like my knitting is not consistent enough for me to make those type of garments that I feel comfortable with. But sweaters are a lot more forgiving for me than a pair of fingerless mitts or a pair of mittens. I have a pair of mittens. One fits well, the other one does not.
And when you knit socks, you always have the angry sock.
I usually have an angry sock,
which is tighter knit than the other one.
I always feel like I can make more adjustments when I'm sweater knitting, to make sure that things are going to work out in the long run because it's a bigger thing.
Kathleen has the comment that, if you knit socks, you can totally knit a sweater because the type of adjustments you make for socks that fit properly are exactly the same sort of things for the sweater.
If you can knit yourself socks that you like the fit of, you can knit yourself a sweater.
And it's a lot easier for you to look at your foot and understand the shape and dimensions of your foot than it is to understand the shape and dimensions of what is literally behind you. But get a friend to help you measure.
Right. And if you're worried, pick something like a top-down sweater that you can put on waste yarn or spare needles or stuff so that you can try it on while you're knitting it.
Oh, yeah. That's my favorite thing to do.
And see whether or not it fits you. Nick and I, we don't have standard bodies, and I think very few people do have standard bodies. Okay? And so typical patterns don't fit us. We have to adjust them to fit our bodies. And so being able to do something like a top-down sweater, where you can try it on. Top-down sweaters knit in the round are great for sweaters because you can try them on and be like, oh, I need the armhole to be a little bit deeper. Or no, I've made it too deep. I need to rip it back and start my body now. Oh, I need to make the body longer.
And for people
so
like me...
So it hits where I want it to be.
And for people like me who've got a really tall body, to know, okay, I've had
you
many
have to
patterns.
Usually add a couple inches.
I have to add like 4 inches usually. I've got patterns that will end like here, and I still have like 4 to 6 inches more chest. So
that's why I inherit a lot of his sweaters because the torsos end up being too short, but they fit me.
Talking about weird matching of dimensions, yes, we've got the same chest dimension. Our legs are also the same length, but you notice sitting down here, I'm taller than her. So
Nick's torso is about probably 3 to 4 inches taller. That's the entire difference in our height is Nick's torso.
Yeah. And I like this comment from Elizabeth that if you're intimidated by the number of stitches in a sweater, really, depending on your weight of yarn, a sweater can have fewer stitches than a sock.
Yes.
Right? Not very often, but it can.
It can.
Yeah. One particular... So, okay, we've talked about all this stuff, and people are really anxious about the fitting, and I get that because it took me, 4 sweaters knitting to myself to get one that I was really happy with. And even then I messed up the ribbing at the bottom.
But that's because you started listening.
So, yes, everybody here is listening to you, so they start off with an advantage. But there is one pattern, and I don't remember the name of it, that you'll probably know it off the top of your head, where it's basically a big panel and really short sleeves, but it's this almost square.
Oh, the boxy?
The boxy, yeah.
Yes.
So the boxy, I think, it's really good for showing off yarn.
Yeah.
It's really easy. It's
just make sure the armhole is deep enough for you.
Yeah, that's the only thing you got to be careful about, because if I remember correctly, all the comments are the armhole for the boxy is designed very shallow.
Yeah, if you are a larger lady with larger arms, the armhole depth is not right for you. So, but that's easily taken care of. I knit a different one of Hohilo Catelli's patterns that is kind of similar, and it went to the armhole depth, and it was like 7 inches, and then joined for the body. And I'm like, well, that gives 14 inches for the circumference of my upper arm. My upper arm is more like 17, 18 inches. I'm like, my arm is not fitting in that, and I need some room to move. So I deepened it down to, I think I knit like 9 inches before joining. So I had an 18-inch opening. So I had a little bit of positive ease. So, but that is one thing to check if you're making that type of sweater, like the boxy is that type, the weekender. No, the weekender is a little bit different. But like the boxy sweater has really skinny arms, and you might need to make that a little bit deeper if you're a bit larger.
You got guns.
You got guns.
Right. All right. Okay, so I think we've talked about patterns.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great questions. Thank you so much. This is really dynamic. I loved the discussion. I'm not sure I can. Is there anything else you wanted to address?
No, I just, find something relatively simple. Is usually best for hand spun. There's a lot of like kind of choose your own adventure patterns that are out there. You don't need, you did all the hard work in spinning the yarn yourself. Make it easy for you, and enjoy knitting with your hand spun. Sit back and relax and make yourself a garment. And if you don't want to make a garment, it is perfectly okay to make a shawl, or a hat, or a pair of gloves. You'll probably have more success than me.
Yeah, no, and really, I mean, okay, so let's rewind to the whole point of this this giant spin along, right? This is the mashup, right? So we've spent a lot of time about talking about sweater patterns because that is probably the most complex thing that you can do. It's something you can snuggle up with your hard work. Quite frankly, the mashup sweaters that Jill has made for me are my favorite fluffy comfort sweaters. When I'm feeling down and depressed and lonely, I will literally put on one of the mashup sweaters and suddenly feel loved. So it's great, but that's not the only thing you can do. Go back to the tried and true thing. You really want to show off your yarn? Make a scarf. So if you're really getting anxious about it, that is the simplest way that you can show off your wonderful spin project. But
Quaker yarn stretchers are a great use of hand spun.
What is that?
Quaker yarn stretchers, because they're a pattern where you can easily just end whenever you're out of yarn.
There you go. So the other one that I think ended up being really neat for what we're doing for our
the
for
night
base
shift
12 spin along
has worked out really well with hand spun.
Night shift because of the fact
you
that
could take your mashup and use that as the contrast, and then use a commercial yarn for the main color.
And that extends it even further, right? So if you don't have a huge amount of yarn that you've spun, you can use that to extend it. And actually, we'll show up on Instagram pretty soon. We should almost be done soon.
Yarns like Spin Cycle are just hand spun for the masses.
Yeah.
So any of the patterns that use yarns like Spin Cycle are going to look really good in hand spun.
Yeah. Kathleen has the comment of shawls and ponchos are good too, right? So
yep.
We'll post our night shifts on Ravelry, or not our Ravelry, on Instagram. We're about to be done, and we've done sort of negative images of each other. I did mine where the hand spun is the main color, and then the commercial is the contrast, and then Jill has done the opposite. So it has very interesting different effects, and I love them both.
And I did another hand spun night shift this past summer, which went to a friend, and I can repost the photos of it.
Yeah,
it turned out gorgeous.
So yeah, we spent very little time on any other patterns, right? But I think we gave a very good summary right here of like you can. The only thing I wouldn't recommend is don't make socks. Right?
You could mash up to spin for socks.
I guess you could if you picked the right fiber initially, and you spun very tightly. You want to definitely overspin for socks. You could, absolutely. I think one of the best things though about the mashup is the fact that it is a celebration of color and texture of the yarn
Mm-hmm.
itself. So you want to have something that you're going to be able to show off, right?
It's a
Okay.
one of a kind, never to be repeated.
So with that, unless there are any other questions, I see the comments have sort of petered out.
Mm-hmm.
I will end with the dad joke. Although I will say one thing that tomorrow is your birthday, so I'm going to wish you happy birthday here and encourage all of you to extend happy birthday wishes to Jill. Um, she's made some comments and there's been some specials on the website too.
Yeah,
That
there'll be some more tomorrow.
so definitely check it out. And thank you to whoever just bought something. Um, so with that, oh yeah, and Kathleen also has the final comment. If you don't like the finished garment, you can always rip it out, reblock the yarn, and try something else.
Yep.
Absolutely. That's the best thing about knitting. You can always redo it.
Gab has a mashup sweater that I think I'm going to rip out to reclaim the yarn because she has outgrown it.
Nice. So one thing that you can't undo is chemistry, right? Periodic table. Well, I don't hate all of it, just some elements. There's your dad joke for the evening. We've got lots of good happy birthdays for Jill. So
Yep.
thank you very much, everyone,
Remember
for
to share
joining
your
us.
projects on Instagram and Ravelry and Facebook.
And if you're watching this not as the live stream, please make sure you can comment on the comments here on YouTube. Find us on Instagram.
HipStrings on
HipStrings.
Instagram, Facebook, Ravelry.
And Mr. HipStrings on Instagram for me. Yes, we're done with the live videos for the spin along, as Angela asks. But I think if you guys all
We'll be
agree,
back.
we've been having fun with doing this. This is a lot easier for us to do than doing the formal podcast. So you haven't seen The Last of Us. I think we're going to
So
keep
if
doing
you have
this.
things that you would like us to talk about, please let us know. I already know I need to rant about, yarn choice and knitwear designs.
Yeah.
And what gauge yarn should be knit at.
Yep. Oh, and we need to talk about. We still need to finally do our hand spinning spindle video and all that
Yes.
stuff.
Yeah, if you want us to do like quick little tutorials too, we are entertaining those options. We have a little bit more free time lately.
What?
We might be spending a little bit more time at home than usual.
Yeah, but still, I think we wanna maintain this because this is
Yeah.
this is very fun for us as well. So we really appreciate the interaction. Oh, favorite cocktails. There's one.
Oh, yes.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks for joining us all this time, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Good night.